Well, hello. Back for the second podcast for Necessary Security. Last time I had a great conversation with Bryce Johnson, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Catherine Gilligan, who I have worked with in my past, and she has graciously made time for us today to have a conversation. So, Katie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Katie Gilligan. I have a varied background. We worked together on building up a threat modeling program. But the general trend of my career is I've spent a lot of time either building programs from scratch or redesigning and improving programs that already existed. So I did some of that in the Coast Guard. Um, I spent some time doing regulatory compliance from the government side as a regulator for commercial vessels and the oil and gas industry. And then I spent some time where we worked together at a bank doing some program development, but also doing some security architecture and threat modeling.
Yeah, awesome. Uh, Fun fact about Katie that I learned over time, and I love this about her from not just a person, but from anybody that you're working with, is she will challenge what you say. She critically thinks about things you write and say, and then gives you an a really great response, well thought through response. And I think in threat modeling in general, I think you can't get better than that. So I'm
Thank
really
you.
yeah, no, hey, you have made me better just by making me work harder to not hear that. Well, actually, but
We
yeah,
we had some very good times pushing back against each other.
no, that's great. It is really good. But today, the conversation that we're gonna share is kind of about like security frameworks, how companies work, and who those organizations teams are that are telling us what and why we should be doing things. How did we get there? And just overall, like, what is the difference when we tie this back to threat modeling, process versus program, and kind of where that takes us? So, I mean, let's just start at the high level. What is it that people don't get that threat modeling process, things I do, how do I assess risk, threat modeling program, how what I do with what I've produced, and who do I integrate with, and what value. So you've done this. So I mean, what's your experience here, and why are people confused?
I think that part of it comes down to just the general difference between a process and a program. So, when we talk about the process of threat modeling, that's the actual doing of a threat model. And then the carrying through of everything from the artifacts come to the threat modelers, and we take a look at the possible risks and threats and vulnerabilities that are presented by that, and then propose mitigations for those. And then that follows through to those mitigations get handed off to engineers who then build them, right? So that's the practice of threat modeling, the process of threat modeling. The program of threat modeling, like all other programs, we're thinking about a broader view. Where does this fit into our bigger picture? So when we think about programs, we think about repeatability, we think about integration, and we think about how do we make this a practice that can be done everywhere in the organization in a very similar way and be managed so that we're no longer playing whack-a-mole with risks. And that's not to say that we're ever going to be in a position where all of the important vulnerabilities are perfectly managed and we're able to do all of the technical work that is required all of the time. We know that that is a constant struggle between the timelines that we have and the resources that we have and the priorities that need to be met. But when we think about a program level, where do all of the practices that go into this development and management and ongoing maintenance process fit into the larger picture together? So it's not just the practice of threat modeling, but the integration between the practice of identifying threats within specific architectures to how do those tie out to our compliance teams, and where is the partnerships there? How does that how does that connect out to our records management teams, and where are the partnerships there? And how do we bring in all of those voices to be able to do seamless handoffs as we move through the life cycle of any given technology?
I really like that. I think just because there's a lot of conversations going on where people are stuck in the process and they want to have the conversation about how do I get adoption, how do I show value, other things like that. I think just to pick one thing of what you said and try and make it real and kind of get your feeling about it is that integration. So when you're talking about the compliance teams, the risk teams, and other things like that, working into where the business is operating, it's a process is going to identify the threats. And you could
Mhm.
have the best process in the world and the smartest people in the world doing it, and you have a list of threats. Well, that's great because you and your team now have this list of threats, and your process has completed, and nobody else cares.
Yes.
So why does the program matter at that point? Like how would that person get that value or get really the mitigation done that they are truly wanting?
Yeah. So I think a lot of that comes down to communicating the whys of like you have this list of threats that you've now identified, right? Why do those matter? Well, when we look at them like within a team that is only concerned about the security vulnerabilities, they're going to be looking for the tactical security vulnerabilities. But those connect out to broader conversations. Those security vulnerabilities may be required to be remediated because of relevant regulations that apply to our industry, right? So there's that conversation point there. How we think about the connection between like why are we doing this? Part of why we're doing this, part of why we care about security at all is because security is a risk to the business. It's a risk to our customers. It's a reputational risk to us. We want to reduce our viability as a target to to bad actors. And there's a variety of reasons that bad actors are acting in the ways that they are. But those also translate to the things that the business cares about as well. And so, like some of the things that the larger enterprise cares about are what is our regulatory risk? We don't want to be under a consent order. Consent orders are public. They're not only a monetary risk to us, but they're a reputational risk to us. And also, we're required then to actually answer the things that we've agreed to because we're out of compliance. And the penalties continue to grow if we don't. So it if we find threats early in the design process and are able to raise those for remediation early in the design process and bring those compliance voices into that early stage of the design process, then your developers aren't hit at the very last stage of the design process or of the development process even with this is great, you've built a thing, but it violates all of these internal requirements. Now you have to go back and redo that work. Or we're going to take a whole bunch of risk exceptions. And risk exceptions don't remove the risk. These are things that still need to be remediated. So thinking about this in the wider context, building out a program that we can even think about it as an enterprise risk management type program that just includes this practice of threat modeling in it, allows us to do a much better job of that like shift left concept, not just for our security threats, but for providing a pathway for all of those checklists that we do at the end of the process to move further up so that we can think about them in design and so that we can get those voices in the room during design.
I love it. I'm going to summarize that for the audience a little bit, and let me know if I misrepresented. Integrating the process into a program that partners with other institutional risk programs gets visibility and then prioritization to actually get work done because they have the authority to say, we must do this.
Mhm.
Is that about right?
I think so, and it also has the potential then to reduce the overall work that needs to be done, because instead of doing a task once and then finding out that you need to make changes to it after it's already done, you can do the task in the compliant way to start with.
Absolutely. And also for the things that aren't prioritized, they're they still have visibility. They're still in the risk register now. And
Mhm.
so when people start to do analysis on the data, they can say, I have this type of risk all over the place. If I just fix this one thing, I could reduce my risk by this much. And
Yeah, absolutely.
instead
And
of
you've done a lot of work on thinking about that, like, standardization and templatization thing, which is slightly different than checklists. Like, we're very familiar with security by checklist, and there's a lot of reasons why that is a practice that is kind of important. But with the artifacts that you're creating during threat modeling, it also opens you up for the opportunity to not only have this standard idea of this implementation in this type of architecture presents this set of vulnerabilities to us or this set of threats to us. And here's the thing that we do to mitigate it, and we do it in the same way every time. That reduces so much of the overhead mental load of solving a problem because you've solved the problem and then you
I
can just implement the solutions.
I am when I edit this video, I'm gonna cut that little part out because you have just summarized my talk at ThreatModCon. I love it. Thank you.
Perfect. Excellent.
So we've talked about the overall like process versus program, and we've introduced that there are organizational groups in every financial services firm and most regulated firms and in some non-regulated firms. Let's start talking about who they are and let's name them and so people understand like, oh, I have that group. I didn't know they were related to anything I did. So what
Yeah.
are some examples of what those groups are called?
So this is just based on like our shared experience within the organizations that we've worked in. It may not hold true for everywhere, and we may miss some parties that we're not aware of.
Sure.
But people that I tried to make a habit of reaching out to, that you might not think about, like obviously you've got your information security people. And information security is very important, and there are several different flavors of information security teams that might exist in an organization. And some of them are going to be very, very technically hands on, and others of those teams are going to be very, very policy focused. And both of those are important. So, understanding the scope of whether you have multiple information security teams that you need to be interacting with, or you have a single information security point of contact that is your person for your set of projects, is important. And the answer might be different even within the same organization. But then we have other teams that might not get thought about as much from like the security perspective that could have a really important um, role in like the long-term product success. So I like to work as closely as I can with the records risk management team or the records management team associated with the part of the organization I'm working with, because records management is a very detailed set of requirements that may be regulatory requirements and may be serious regulatory requirements depending on the industry. And the actual implementation of those requirements may be a little finicky, and you might have to put a lot of thought into it. So having those people involved in the conversation, or at least having an understanding that this is a thing that you should be thinking about early, can really make a change in the technical decisions that you're making about what you're classifying as records and how you're managing them, and
Right.
what you are purposefully not maintaining because they are not records and are in fact just risks to your organization and your customer. And I don't mean to say that in a nefarious way. Holding on to all of the information all of the time is not necessarily a safe practice. But other teams that you might want to think about is if your product is internal facing, there may be a quality and compliance team associated with the business that is using it. And they might have specific needs for how they collect data on how the users of those systems are using that. And those might be technical requirements that you're not aware of early, and they may be technical requirements that introduce risk. So thinking about the broad scope of, do we have the stakeholders that make sense beyond just our business stakeholders, is a good practice to get in. And introducing a program or bringing your risk management programs together under a program like a threat modeling program would give you the opportunity to make sure that those connections are consistently made.
Yeah. So for that, and just to throw in a couple names out there, because anybody that's in the U.S. and is regulated by the OCC, they're guided by the FFEIC guidebooks, and in that they clearly define the shape and size and mandate of an organization called Operational Risk Management, and that's a risk and controls team like you were describing. I'm just
Yep.
going down a little bit further, and typically they are referred to as second line defense. First line being the threat modelers or the pen testers or other engineers. And then third line is internal audit. And obviously they have different functions within regulated companies, but ultimately anybody that's worked with ORM is going to know these are people that are going to come tell you how to do your job, or if your process is not thorough or complete enough. And then,
I think that it is, as much as it feels like it should be an adversarial relationship with teams like independent audit, um, in my opinion, audit is your best friend. Audit is the enterprise's best friend. Audit's job is to make sure that you don't get in trouble with the regulators. So they're going to create more work for you. It's going to feel like they're telling you how to do your job. It's going to feel incredibly uncomfortable. There's an extraordinary amount of work that goes into preparing for an audit, but audit is your best friend, even if they feel adversarial.
and this, if anybody's watching and just seeing me tense up, uh, this is one of the reasons why Katie challenged me when I first met her and was working with her, is that perspective. I agree with her now fully, and I had to come around to the internal reconciliation of why. And a lot of that was more around, am I prepared enough in what I've built to share it openly with someone who really doesn't understand the technical depth of what it is I'm doing? And it's not about them understanding as much as I do in the thing I do. It's, can I explain to someone who understands process and regulation very, very well that I have met those obligations? And if I can't do that, then their job is to say, there's a risk here of us being exposed to our regulator and getting a fine. And that was what my internal reconciliation was.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good insight. So I played a little bit on the other side of the fence on this one. I was a regulator for a number of years. It's important to note that I was a regulator in a different industry, and that each industry's regulatory bodies are going to have their own culture, their own drivers, and their own flavor of regulations. So your mileage may vary here, but I when I would go to a vessel that had good internal audit, we were gonna have a good day, because not because they get like an unfair leg up, but because their internal team understands why I care about the things that I care about. Um, why these regulations are important. And they're not because I'm on a power trip, they're because these regulations are written in blood. And what that means for your industry is going to vary. Sometimes we're talking like these regulations follow like literal catastrophic emergencies where people die. And sometimes these regulations follow events where things go cataclysmically wrong in less violent ways, right? But even still, there's a reason why the regulations exist, and there's a reason why different regulatory bodies are particularly focused on different aspects of their regulations. So, a good internal audit team is going to know that and is going to be able to drive a culture internally by what they care about in their audit that makes sure that that story is coming across really, really clearly for your regulators. If if you can convince your audit team that you are meeting the spirit of the regulation, you're going to be in pretty good shape. With your documentation is going to be in order. You're not going to be in a place where you're scrambling to find the justifications. If I came to a boat and their paperwork was beautiful and they knew the things that I was going to ask before I asked them, we're still going to do a very thorough inspection, but it's probably going to be a pretty good day because they understand why I care about things.
And I think that that's really great for people to understand that maybe still be just thinking about, well, I just do threat modeling. And it's like, no, no, no. Your function is entirely tied to what IA, ORM, and other risk and controls functions are doing. You are just providing the content that they need to then format to say, this is how we've achieved the goal of the control.
Yeah.
So, but okay, so we've talked about like process program, and that led us to the integrations with these new teams. We've now named and defined kind of the functions of those teams. So let's talk a little bit about frameworks and all these things that people talk about and try and map to. And audit loves a good mapping between one framework to another. MITRE just came out with a super great mapping to several different frameworks. So to your heart's content, you can say this goes to NIST whatever, or this goes to OWASP whatever. Super. But why? What are these good for?
They're good for a lot and they're good for nothing at all, I think is where we come down to, right? So the landscape is very complex. And we know that it's helpful to have not a cheat sheet, but a formatted, structured way to think through problems. And that's really where we get to with these established frameworks is they are formulated like standardized ways to consider an architecture. And we end up with so many of them because just like different regulatory bodies have different things that are their most focused. Um, different people in this community, different organizations in this community are going to be especially focused on different hot topics and also are going to find different practices more beneficial to them. So we end up with this broad landscape of different tool sets for thinking your way through problems. And I think it's important here that like the way that we think about threat modeling doesn't throw out those checklists and frameworks. What it does is provide some guidelines for a practice to think through how to use what, where, and when it's helpful for us, and how to make not just the framework write up standardized, but also have rules and thought processes for the actual practice itself. I'm not sure I answered the question fully.
I know I think you definitely framed it right and got us thinking in the right direction of why they exist. Process people, the teams that we just spoke about, they are process people by nature because they have to explain that the process is comprehensive and complete, and each step builds to the completion of the control. And
Yeah.
that's the story that you share to your regulator. Now, that leads to this whole mapping thing because that makes everything standardized and easy. And if I have this list of controls and I could go check, 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 I'm super happy.
But
Now,
we've both filled out those checklists and it doesn't go check, 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 check. And I think that that's the thing that kind of differentiates threat modeling. The checklists are important. Um, in part, some regulatory bodies regulate not just by their regulations, but have a regulation within their book of regulations that says something to the effect of you have to follow your internal processes and you have to create internal processes that meet these requirements. So, like a good example is going to be a software delivery lifecycle or service delivery lifecycle and project management practice. Like those are things that you're going to see in a lot uh, of of regulatory schemes. So you have to follow your internal processes. How do we know we're following our internal processes? Well, we have a checklist. You fill out the checklist gets reviewed. We followed our internal processes. Here's the artifact that shows that we followed our internal processes. But our development landscape is complex. And we know that those checklists are designed to be written broadly enough to be applied anywhere, but narrowly enough to be able to actually answer them. And in practice, what we find is that I don't know about you, but for me, the places where you're like, is this applicable? Does this language make sense? How is this applicable to the thing that I'm building right now? I think it's not applicable, but my compliance partner doesn't believe me on that. And I can't articulate why because the wording is strange for the context that we're in. Um, Threat modeling gives you a way to talk about that. That's not just like, here's this confusing checklist. Because then we can map back to the confusing checklist. But in the practice, like what we actually want to do is be secure and then also provide the documentation after the fact back to those requirements to show that we are meeting it. And especially as we work through some like emerging technologies, we're going to have real conversations about what models risk management means and whether models should follow software requirements or the like traditional data science requirements. Like there are some fuzzy areas that make the jobs that we sit in increasingly complex and increasingly difficult to fit into a nice pretty checklist.
Well, I have some examples here. Just to kind of bring it back to anybody who's like, well, I'm a threat modeler. We're kind of talking about things that are above where I normally have to operate or think about. But to build a program and be successful at getting adoption for your threat modeling process, these are the things that are important because that actually ties you into what the business must do. So as I explained it to some of the newer people, less experienced threat modelers that join the team, uh, checklist was something they were familiar with because they'd been in IT for a while. They like worked with audit before. And then there was threat modeling. What's the difference and why? I said, well, have you ever heard of a tool called Nessus or any other threat scanner? And they're like, well, sure, yeah, of course. I'm like, the way that works is it starts off very basic. What are you? Or what ports and services are open on the internet? Great, these ports and services are open. Based on some detail that the responses came back on, I can assume it's a Windows system behind there. So I'm going to then ask these questions to confirm that. Oh yeah, you're definitely a Windows service behind there. Great, now what else is there? And it just kind of spiders out. And
Mhm.
that's threat modeling.
Yeah.
It takes you where the information in the configuration takes you. So when you're reviewing code, reviewing infrastructure, reviewing a process, it just spiders out. Whereas a checklist is rigid and it says, these are the data points I need you to tell me about. The merging of these two things is the frameworks that are out there. And there's many frameworks. So I know I was pushed into a situation where I had to use a singular framework for all my identified risks to map it to that framework. The reason for that, and again, this is just because process and scale comes into play, I need to know how many of this thing I have. And by
Mhm.
mapping it to the single framework, that's achievable. Now, we know that infrastructure or cloud frameworks have limitations as far as what they're. Then there's application frameworks. Then there's
Yep.
AI frameworks. Then there's whatever else. Um, but those would be purpose built and better fit. So we would map to those first and say, this is actually what it is.
Mhm.
Then we cram it into a high level category of whatever guest frame or managed framework there was. That is two things. It solves by integrating into the high level process, but it also, if you're using the appropriate framework and then mapping it there, what you've done is shown that it's real. And
Yep.
you were there when we made that transition where people said, I don't think you know this technology as good as I do, or I just don't believe you. And
Yep.
because you created a threat and it was like, oh, it's imaginary, theoretical, I think was the word everybody used. Um, but then when we started mapping it to these frameworks and said, no, these are all publicly referenceable, like you're gonna argue with
Yeah.
NIST, you're gonna argue with MITRE, like, and that's when we really got
Yeah.
traction.
There was a lot more trust in the practice when we could point back to a an industry standard. Um, did I go to that practice kicking and screaming? A little bit, but not because it was wrong, because I was, set in my ways at the time, and it worked. It worked better, at least. It is a way to get like validation for, are we doing the thing that we're trying to do? And also a way to frame the conversation to your other stakeholders of why this needs to get prioritized.
Yeah, and so I think that's the kind of the salient point there for everybody is the tie-in to the institutions of your company using the methods that they can consume makes your process viable and something that they will demand rather than you have to push for their adoption.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's I think what everybody is there. Okay, but then we it sounds like we just tied everything up with a bow and everything's going to work now. But in reality, we come back to the our standards and policies and process documents are circular references. They're not measurable. There's no requirement anywhere. Like, how did we get there, and how do we help ourselves move forward?
I think that that's very complex. How we got here is doing the best that we can. At the end of the day, we're entirely in the risk management conversation. Even when we're talking about regulatory compliance, we're in this risk management conversation. And the reality is we're not in the business of sitting in padded rooms. There is risk associated with the business. So we are managing the best that we can. And these monoliths of policy documents get developed over time. In an ideal world, you would be able to create a perfect hierarchy of policy documents where documents exclusively referenced each other in one direction, where a level of policy document consistently has the driving authority. The simplistic way to look at it is how laws and regulations filter down. That like laws are like established the jurisdiction and authority, regulations establish the details of what is being regulated, and then there are a series of instruction documents and policies below there that detail out the instructions of how, either to the regulators or to as advice to the community being regulated, right? But that's an like within an enterprise, that is an enormous effort. That is an enormous non-revenue generating effort.
Yeah.
So we're doing the best that we can. So that's where programs like the proposed threat modeling program come in, because it gives you an opportunity to think about how this happens at a broad scale and to frame out how we work through getting our policy documents so that they reference in one direction, and getting our teams integrated in a way that there are clear relationships between the groups. Yeah, so how did we get here? This is a hard job. Like the job of risk management within an institution is a uphill battle. there are always going to be more risks than we have the resources to mitigate. And the policies are going just like regulations do. Like we talk about regulations being written in blood, your policies are going to address things as they come up. And so having a program that integrates the voices that are involved in the actual work at least gives you a point for discussion on getting your policies in line.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely good for people understanding, like, what sure, there's policies, and haven't they always been here? Isn't that just like part of the business? But in reality, it's individuals making an effort to write them, improve them, and demonstrating that, okay, this needs to be testable. And I know I spent a couple years working on unrelated policies and standards to get to the point where I could write a uh, risk or threat description and
Mhm.
tie the mitigation back to a standard or a policy so that it was verifiably via, some code or test or, exercise,
Yeah.
that it was either yes done or no not done.
Yeah.
And but that took
Hey, you
years.
are actually required to do that. Here is the policy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for the threat modelers out there, when you create your standard or your process, ensure that the things that you're going to have to do, like there's going to be a mandate in your information security policy that is a very high level policy at your company, which, by the way, the teams that we were referring to, they own and they write. So it's good to have that relationship so that when
Mhm.
they come in and say, oh, you're writing a standard now and it's governed by my policy. Oh, okay. So now you want to work with me.
Yeah.
And this is why that integration and knowing and having the awareness and the relationships there is super important.
Yeah, and just like that, knowing where you sit in the existing policy directory. Like one of our superpowers was just knowing that the policy directory existed and going to it consistently. It's shocking how effective you can be in framing the conversation if you have the working ability to move through the formatting and organization of your organization's policy directory.
all right. Okay. So we had a conversation that really could have gone on for hours and days just because of the depth of a lot of those questions and kind of how big some of the history of these teams and policies and all that kind of fun stuff. But I think we did a good job. I think with your help, I think people really do understand the connectivity between my a thermonic process program and then into the other institutions of your organizations that are regulated. Um, but let's finish out with something a little bit more like aspirational. Uh, where does this go? I mean, because we all know how to do threat modeling, and we've just learned about integrations and how to build into a program. Awesome. Where do we go from there? Like, how do we know what's coming?
I think that that is a really interesting question to work through. And I think that the answer might be a little different for each organization based on like their culture and their goals and the types of things that they're building. One of the things that we had talked about a lot over the last couple of years is like the balancing of scalability and standardization with like being able to support emerging technologies, right? So, a nice thing about the threat modeling practice and its inclusion in a larger program is we talked a lot about templatizing, not just threats, but also architectures that have like architecture segments that have already been threat modeled. And here's your pattern that already has controls pre-built for it. If you want a storage solution, here you go. Stick this into your larger architecture. So there's a piece of it that's like there is an opportunity here for being able to support faster designs because we already have some things that we know work. And if they're going to work for your use case, if they fit your business needs, here you go. And then we can start caring about the more interesting threats, the deeper threats, the more expansive threats. And so the fun doesn't stop for the threat modeling community because we know that cybersecurity is a cat and mouse game. We're trying to stay one step ahead of the bad actors, and like especially for financial institutions, they're a rich target for a bunch of different reasons. So it like being able to have a standardized practice that is not following a checklist, but is instead making use of people's brains and actually critically thinking through what are the risks here and what are the branching risks here and how do they fit into this larger picture with all of the other parts of operational risk management and the things that they're going to care about early in the design process so that we can free up our engineering resources to start thinking about bigger problems to solve so that it's not just a constant struggle against a mountain of tech debt and a mountain of security debt. And still let ourselves be in that space of playing that cat and mouse game and thinking about what the next set of issues are going to be and how we identify them and remediate them as well.
I love it, and I really like that, and I hope people stay tuned because there will be another podcast specifically around some of those categories because they are really important in your journey from starting out into higher levels of maturity, higher levels of automation, scalability, and integration, things like that. So I think each one of those topics is worth a podcast just so people really get the how. But so Katie, I really appreciate you taking time to speak with me today and sharing your thoughts with everybody. Anything you want to close out on?
No, just that thank you for having me. This was a fun conversation, and I'm glad that we got to work through some of these really interesting like organizational questions and how to think strategically about what your program should look like from a larger picture and who needs to be involved in it.
No, awesome. So thank you again, and that is going to be the closeout of our second podcast with Katie Gilligan. Thank you so much.